In 2003, a devoted Minnesota couple set out on a peaceful canoe trip and vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. Then, 16 years later, a storm-tossed paddle bearing their initials washes ashore, reigniting an investigation that uncovers the haunting truth of what really happened on the water. The Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota stretched out like a vast mirror, its quiet broken only by the call of loons and the steady dip of paddles cutting through the water. On a bright July morning in 2003, Mark and Lila Jensen loaded their red canoe with camping gear, food packed into waterproof bags, and a sense of eager anticipation. Friends described them as inseparable, both teachers who spent summers exploring the lakes, their bond as steady as the current beneath their canoe. They had spoken often of this trip, a week-long escape into wilderness where there were no roads, no phones, only the rhythm of the water and the comfort of each other's company. A park ranger passing by the trailhead that morning had nodded to them, later recalling their easy smiles and the way Lila lifted her camera to capture the lake behind him. Mark carried their paddle with initials faintly etched into the wood, a tradition they started on their first trip years earlier. The couple looked entirely at peace, confident in their experience, and nothing in that brief moment suggested that they were about to vanish without explanation. When they failed to return to Duluth on the expected day, friends thought it was just a delay, the kind of thing that happened often in the Boundary Waters where storms could blow in and routes could change. But by the end of that week, concern turned into alarm. Their car was found parked neatly at the trailhead, keys still inside the glove box, and a cooler with leftover food waiting in the trunk. Rangers retraced their steps and followed the portage routes they might have taken, scanning shorelines for signs of a campfire or a tent. Eventually, a campsite was located beside a narrow bay. Their tent was still standing, sleeping bags unrolled inside, a small cooking pot blackened from fire sitting by a stone ring. The canoe, however, was gone. With no sign of struggle and no footprints leading away, the scene was as puzzling as it was unsettling. The search that followed was exhaustive, helicopters circling overhead, dive teams plunging into the deep waters, and volunteers paddling mile after mile along twisting inlets. Yet no bodies, no canoe, and no trace of Mark and Lila were ever found. It was as if the wilderness had quietly absorbed them, leaving behind only silence and questions that lingered long after the search ended. The discovery of the abandoned campsite baffled investigators from the very beginning. Rangers who knew the Boundary Waters well described it as oddly still, as though the couple had stepped away for a moment and never returned. Their packs were propped against a tree, food sealed and untouched, a lantern resting on a flat rock where it had been placed the night before. Nothing appeared ransacked or hurried, no sign of wild animals tearing into supplies, no overturned canoe dragged away by wind. The most troubling detail was the absence of the canoe itself, the vessel that should have been secured along the shore but was nowhere in sight. Search teams widened their perimeter, tracing every bay and inlet that could have concealed a capsized canoe. The waters were cold even in July, and dangerous in places where sudden winds whipped across open stretches. Divers combed the depths of nearby lakes, but visibility was poor, the bottom thick with weeds and debris that could easily hide wreckage. Helicopters with infrared scanners swept the treetops, hoping to pick up heat signatures if the couple had wandered injured into the forest. Day after day, the search pressed forward, but each evening brought nothing but silence. Family members drove up from Duluth and camped near the staging area, desperate to remain close to the investigation. Lila's sister recalled standing at the water's edge late at night, staring across the black expanse of the lake, whispering her sister's name into the wind as if it might carry a response. Mark's father helped distribute maps to volunteer paddlers, his hands shaking as he marked out search grids with a pen. Every lead, every reported sighting of a red canoe ended in disappointment. After 2 weeks, officials scaled back operations, admitting the likelihood of survival was minimal. The lack of debris was confounding. Life vests, paddles, even scraps of clothing usually surfaced in accidents. But nothing belonging to Mark or Lila ever did. It was as though the lake had swallowed them whole. The families were left with an ache made sharper by the absence of answers. Without bodies or wreckage, there could be no funeral, no closure, only the endless question of what had happened on that still summer day when a canoe slipped away from shore and never returned. News of the vanished couple spread quickly through northern Minnesota, shaking the tight communities that bordered the boundary waters. At first, there was disbelief that two experienced paddlers like Mark and Lila could simply disappear. Friends described them as careful planners who knew the dangers of sudden storms and respected the unpredictability of wilderness travel. They carried detailed maps, always wore life vests, and never pushed themselves beyond what conditions allowed. Their disappearance felt unnatural, as if something more than accident had played a role. Local newspapers printed daily updates, their front pages carrying photographs of the smiling couple in flannel shirts, often framed by the bow of their red canoe. Television crews arrived in Ely and Grand Marais, interviewing neighbors who remembered their excitement before the trip. Reporters followed search boats as they glided along black water, cameras catching the grim faces of volunteers peering into the shadows beneath the trees. Every evening, news anchors repeated the same lines. No new leads, no sign of the canoe, no explanation for the vanishing. As the weeks stretched into months, speculation grew. Some whispered that they had drowned together, their bodies tangled beneath the weeds where no diver could reach. Others believed they had wandered off, caught in a sudden storm, and succumbed to exposure deep in the forest. Darker theories hinted at foul play, suggesting an argument had turned violent, though no evidence supported it. A few even claimed the couple staged their disappearance to escape debts or responsibilities, a rumor that cut deeply into the families already suffering under the weight of uncertainty. The boundary waters itself seemed complicit in their silence. Vast and unforgiving, it offered no clues, only mirrored skies and endless stretches of forest where sound carried strangely and trails vanished into moss. For the families, hope flickered and dimmed with each passing season. Birthdays came and went, holidays gathered around tables with empty chairs. Lila's sister clung to her belief that answers would surface one day, no matter how long it took, while Mark's parents found themselves retreating from public vigils, exhausted by the stares of sympathy that never eased their pain. By the end of the year, the case had grown cold. The red canoe, once so familiar, had become a ghost story whispered among paddlers, a reminder of how quickly the wilderness could take and how completely it could refuse to give back. Winter closed over the boundary waters like a heavy curtain, freezing the lakes and burying the trails beneath deep snow. By then, the official search for Mark and Lila had ended, though their families pressed on with private efforts. Flyers with their photographs appeared on bulletin boards in bait shops and ranger stations, the corners curling in the cold. Volunteers continued to paddle sections of the waterways when the ice broke each spring, hoping for a glimpse of a canoe half buried in reeds or a paddle drifting loose, but nothing surfaced. Each year that passed seemed to deepen the mystery rather than bring it closer to resolution. For investigators, the case was maddening in its lack of evidence. Accidents left behind something, even if only scraps of fabric or metal. Drownings produced bodies within days once the water shifted. Yet here, there was nothing. The campsite had remained eerily undisturbed, as if frozen in time, a small museum of a life interrupted. Rangers would occasionally check on it in subsequent seasons, finding the fire ring moss covered and the outlines of the tent pads sinking back into the earth. The wilderness reclaimed what it could, but the absence of the canoe continued to gnaw at those who had searched. The families clung to hope in different ways. Lila's sister poured her energy into maintaining a website dedicated to the couple, updating it with any rumor or possible sighting. She refused to use the word memorial, insisting it was a space for information, not grief. Mark's parents visited the lakes once each summer, carrying flowers that they scattered into the water. A ritual they admitted brought little comfort, but felt impossible to abandon. Their belief wavered between faint hope of survival and the grim possibility that the couple lay forever hidden beneath the surface. As the years slipped by, The disappearance of Mark and Lila became less a breaking news story and more a haunting local legend. Campers would lower their voices when telling newcomers about the married pair who vanished without a trace, their canoe never found, their fate unknown. Guides spoke of it quietly around campfires, a cautionary tale about the unforgiving wilderness. The Boundary Waters had claimed many lives before, but none in a way that left so many questions. By the end of that first year, the case stood at a standstill, waiting in silence, as if the lakes themselves guarded the truth beneath their dark waters. The official file on the disappearance of Mark and Lila Jensen grew thicker in the months that followed, filled with interviews, search maps, and reports that offered no real answers. Detectives pored over timelines, noting when the couple had last been seen and how long it took before alarm was raised. They interviewed fellow campers who remembered hearing laughter on the lake that weekend, the steady thump of paddles echoing across the water. None had seen anything unusual, no arguments, no overturned canoe drifting free. It was as if the pair had vanished in the span of a heartbeat. Theories began to fracture even within law enforcement. Some believed a sudden storm had capsized their canoe and dragged them into the depths where currents made recovery impossible. Others suspected foul play, that perhaps another camper had crossed their path with darker intentions. A smaller number wondered if the couple had staged it all, slipping quietly into Canada or beyond to begin a new life. Those who knew Mark and Lila dismissed that idea, insisting their lives in Duluth were full of plans, careers, and commitments they would not abandon. Still, the lack of evidence allowed every theory to breathe. For the families, the uncertainty was unbearable. Lila's sister clung to the phone each time it rang, hoping for a lead. Mark's parents pressed for more searches, urging authorities not to let the case fade into obscurity. They raised money, hired private divers, and even reached out to psychics in desperate attempts to uncover the truth. Each effort ended the same way, with silence and disappointment. By the first anniversary, a memorial was held on the shores of Lake Superior, candles flickering in the dusk as friends shared memories of camping trips and summer evenings spent with the couple. Their absence was a wound that refused to heal, a story that no one could finish. Photographs of their smiles stared back from posters pinned to trees and store windows, reminders that lives so full of promise could vanish without a trace. As seasons turned, the Boundary Waters gave no answers. The red canoe never surfaced, no bones were caught in fishermen's nets, no belongings washed ashore. The silence became part of the landscape itself, as though the wilderness had decided to keep its secret buried, leaving the families to wrestle with questions that only grew heavier with time. The second year after Mark and Lila's disappearance carried a heavier silence than the first. The initial urgency had faded, and with it the steady stream of searchers who once combed the lakes and forests. What remained was a lingering ache for their families, and an unsolved case tucked into the corner of the sheriff's office, gathering dust between newer investigations. Rangers still spoke of the missing couple when guiding visitors into the Boundary Waters, but the story had begun to sound like a legend, softened at the edges with each retelling. For their loved ones, the absence only deepened. Birthdays passed without celebration, anniversaries without laughter, and holidays became gatherings marked by an empty pair of chairs. Lila's sister carried her photograph to every family event, propping it against the salt and pepper shakers as if her presence could still be summoned. Mark's father drove north each summer to walk the trailhead where their car had been left, staring at the same gravel lot, hoping against reason for some overlooked clue. The smallest details became obsessions, the kinds of things others overlooked. A torn map found in a ranger station, a scrap of red paint on a rock near a portage trail, even a hiker's story of a distant campfire could spark renewed waves of hope. The wilderness, however, yielded nothing. The lakes froze each winter and thawed each spring, swallowing and releasing branches, fish, and debris, but never the red canoe or the couple it carried. Search dogs brought in years later found only old scents, too faint to follow. Sonar sweeps of several lakes returned images that hinted at wreckage, only for divers to discover nothing but fallen trees or tangleweed. It was as if the land itself resisted giving up its secret. By 2005, officials acknowledged quietly what families refused to say aloud. Without bodies or belongings, the truth might never surface. Mark and Lila were listed as presumed drowned, though no death certificates were issued. Their case was marked inactive, a bureaucratic term that did nothing to ease the ache left behind. To those who had loved them, the disappearance was not just a mystery. It was a wound that never closed, a question carried into every new season, waiting for a storm or a shift of fate to disturb the silence that had swallowed their story whole. By the time 3 years had passed, the disappearance of Mark and Lila Jensen had become a ghost story for travelers heading into the Boundary Waters. Guides would mention them quietly to newcomers, not as a warning exactly, but as a reminder of how easily the wilderness could take. Their red canoe was spoken of like an apparition, a vessel that could be glimpsed in mist before fading back into memory. For their families, however, the story was anything but folklore. It remained a daily wound, an absence that pressed against every ordinary moment. Lila's sister began collecting every article, clipping them from newspapers, and saving them in binders that grew heavier with each year. She said the act of archiving gave her control over something that felt uncontrollable, though she admitted at night it only deepened her grief. Mark's mother stopped answering the phone after dark, unable to endure the false hope of strangers who claimed to have spotted the couple alive somewhere far away. Each call left her shaken, suspended between disbelief and the impossible wish that it might be true. Occasionally, tips filtered in to local law enforcement. A fisherman claimed he had seen a flash of red under the water near Basswood Lake. A hiker swore she had heard voices calling from an empty shoreline. Rangers checked each report, often traveling miles into the wilderness to verify, only to find nothing but wind through the pines or the groan of shifting ice. Each lead added weight to the already heavy silence of the case. The authorities quietly shifted focus, prioritizing newer emergencies and treating the Jensen disappearance as a closed chapter. The file sat untouched, the maps curling at the corners, the photographs yellowing under fluorescent light. But for the families, every unanswered question still demanded attention. They lived in the tension between hope and grief, never able to fully mourn, never able to truly believe in survival. The Boundary Waters carried on indifferent, its waters glittering in the sun, its storms rising without warning. Somewhere in its vastness the truth remained, hidden beneath layers of silence and time. And though most had moved on, those closest to Mark and Lila waited, convinced that one day the wilderness would finally return what it had taken. By the 4th year, the disappearance of Mark and Lila Jensen had slipped from headlines into the quiet margins of community memory. New tragedies demanded attention, new mysteries filled the airwaves, yet for those who loved them, the silence only grew heavier. The Boundary Waters remained vast and inscrutable, its black lakes swallowing storms and reflecting the sky with the same indifference. Friends who had once gathered regularly to organize searches now met only occasionally, sharing stories of the couple over coffee, their conversations tapering into the same unanswered questions. The campsite, where their tent had once stood, grew over with grass and moss. Rangers noted that the stone fire ring was slowly collapsing into itself, evidence of seasons passing without human touch. Visitors paddling nearby sometimes stopped there, unaware they were standing on ground where 2 lives had once vanished. For those who did know, the spot carried an uneasy hush, as if the air itself remembered what had happened. Lila's sister struggled most with the lack of closure. She filed repeated requests with the county to keep the investigation open, writing long letters about how her sister's smile still appeared in her dreams. Mark's parents grew quieter, weary from years of interviews and vigils that yielded nothing. They began to avoid community events where people approached them with pity in their eyes, unable to answer the simple question of how they were holding up. The truth was, they were not holding up at all, only moving forward out of necessity, each day carrying the same unanswered weight. Occasional reports still arrived at the sheriff's office. A paddle found floating on a different lake turned out to be modern and unmarked. A canoe spotted in a tangle of reeds proved to be a forgotten rental. Each time, hope flared and died, leaving families more exhausted than before. Officers admitted privately that after so many years, the odds of recovery were vanishingly small. The Boundary Waters had swallowed hundreds of secrets before, and it seemed intent on keeping this one. Yet, despite the silence, the story lingered. Around campfires, travelers still spoke of the married couple who set out smiling one summer morning and never returned. For some, it was a tale of caution; for others, a mystery too haunting to forget. For the families, it was a wound still waiting, unanswered, for the wilderness to give something back. By the 5th year, the Jensen disappearance had hardened into a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved. The search had long been called off, but the families refused to surrender completely. Each summer, they returned to the lakes, driving north, along winding roads lined with pine, until the air smelled of water and wood smoke. They carried photographs laminated against rain, posting them at outfitters and ranger stations, though fewer people paused to look at them now. Time had dulled public interest, but for the families, every season felt raw, as though the couple had vanished only yesterday. One discovery gave them a brief flicker of hope. A ranger cleaning an abandoned car at a storage lot found a notebook in the glove compartment belonging to Mark and Lila. It contained notes from earlier trips, scribbled route plans, sketches of campsites, and one page dated just before they left in 2003. The handwriting spoke of excitement, of wanting to explore a chain of remote lakes that summer. The notebook offered no clues about what had gone wrong, but it became a treasured relic, proof of their joy in planning even as the ending turned so dark. Lila's sister held on to it like a lifeline, reading and rereading passages late into the night. Investigators reopened the file briefly to re-examine the couple's belongings. They tested clothing, maps, and camping gear for anything overlooked in the initial investigation. Nothing emerged. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication the couple had met anyone hostile along the way. The working theory remained accidental drowning, but without bodies or wreckage, even that explanation rang hollow. Detectives admitted to the family that without new evidence, their hands were tied. In Duluth, the Jensen home stood unchanged, as if waiting for its owners to return. Bills were paid from insurance money, the garden was kept neat by neighbors, but inside, dust settled on books and framed photographs. Their absence echoed in every room. Friends who stopped by spoke in hushed tones, unwilling to disturb the stillness. The house became a shrine to lives suspended in mystery. 5 years gone, and yet no answers. The wilderness had offered nothing back, only silence. And though the families tried to move forward, every trail, every shoreline, every paddle stroke reminded them of 2 lives that had vanished into the water and left only questions behind. By the 6th year, the Boundary Waters carried their story like a whisper, woven into the currents of lakes and the rustle of pines. For the families, time had not eased the ache, but only stretched it thinner across the days. Every anniversary reopened wounds, marked by vigils at the shoreline, where candles flickered in paper bags and prayers were spoken into the dusk. Friends gathered with photographs and stories, their voices breaking as they remembered the couple's laughter, the way Mark steadied the canoe while Lila leaned over with her camera, always eager to capture beauty. Each vigil ended the same way, with silence pressing heavy over the water. Detectives admitted quietly that the case had stalled completely. Leads had grown cold, witnesses had moved on, and files now sat untouched in metal cabinets. When family members called for updates, officers offered sympathy but little else. The investigation was still technically open, but resources had shifted to more recent emergencies. For all practical purposes, Mark and Lila's case was dormant, waiting for something new to surface that might never come. Speculation filled the void. Neighbors recalled arguments overheard before the trip, wondering aloud if tension between the couple had played some role. Others whispered about dangers in the wilderness, strangers who could cross paths on remote trails where no one else was watching. Still others clung to the idea of an accident, a sudden gust flipping the canoe and dragging both beneath waters too deep to search. Each theory gained traction only to collapse under lack of evidence, leaving more frustration than comfort. Lila's sister refused to stop searching. She organized small groups of volunteers who hiked remote portage trails, marking off lakes where the canoe might have been carried or abandoned. She corresponded with search experts and even contacted divers from other states, begging them to bring sonar equipment to explore deeper waters. Some came, driven by compassion, but their efforts found nothing beyond logs, boulders, and the shifting shapes of fish. Each failed attempt left her exhausted yet unwilling to let go. The years passed like water slipping through fingers. No belongings surfaced, no bodies were found, no red canoe appeared in the reeds. The silence of the boundary waters seemed absolute, as if it had swallowed Mark and Lila whole, leaving their families to wrestle with the unbearable weight of not knowing what had become of them. By the 7th year, the case of Mark and Lila Jensen had settled into that cruel middle ground where hope and despair existed side by side. Too much time had passed for anyone to believe in survival, yet the absence of proof made it impossible to grieve fully. Their families lived in that hollow space, moving through days marked by routine while carrying an ache that never dulled. Every knock at the door made hearts race with impossible hope. Every unfamiliar number on the phone stirred the question of whether at last an answer had come. Speculation continued to ripple through the communities around the boundary waters. Some whispered that the couple had been caught in a storm and dragged into the depths, their bodies pinned beneath rock and timber where no diver could reach. Others suggested something darker, that another person had been involved, perhaps an unknown camper, or even someone from their past who followed them into the wilderness. The lack of evidence fed every rumor, turning their disappearance into a canvas for fear and imagination. Authorities grew weary of the calls and letters that still trickled in, each new tip repeating what had already been exhausted. Deputies admitted privately that they no longer expected to solve the case, though they remained courteous when family members pressed them for updates. For detectives, the file had become a reminder of a puzzle with missing pieces, one they could not force into completion. For the families, it was a torment that shadowed every waking moment. Lila's sister found herself drawn to Ojibwe elders who lived near the lakes. She listened to stories of spirits that guarded the waters, warnings about those who disrespected the land or entered carelessly. Though she did not believe fully, she found comfort in the idea that her sister's spirit might be watched over, that she was not entirely lost in the black water. Mark's parents, more practical, turned their grief into advocacy, speaking at safety events and urging paddlers to wear life vests and prepare for storms. It was their way of giving purpose to loss, though in quiet moments they admitted they still looked to the shoreline, waiting for their son to return. 7 years gone, and the lakes remained silent. The wilderness kept its secrets, patient and unyielding, while the families endured the unrelenting ache of absence, still waiting for the smallest sign that the boundary waters might one day give something back. By the 8th year, the story of Mark and Lila Jensen had begun to drift into folklore, carried by whispers around campfires and retold by outfitters who guided fresh groups of paddlers into the boundary waters. Their photographs, once bright on missing person posters, had faded in the sunlight of gas stations and ranger cabins. The smiles in those images remained, but the colors had leached away, as if even paper could not withstand the passage of time. For strangers, their disappearance had become a tale of caution. For their families, it remained an open wound. Lila's sister struggled with the way memory blurred. She kept a box filled with her sister's belongings, perfume bottles, letters, a pair of hiking boots still carrying dirt from a trip years before. She would sit with the box on her lap, inhaling the faint trace of scent, willing herself to remember the sound of laughter that time tried to erase. Mark's parents had taken a quieter approach, withdrawing from community events where sympathetic glances and murmured condolences only deepened their grief. They tended their garden and read in the evenings, yet every conversation carried the unspoken weight of absence. The investigation had long gone cold, but occasionally new fragments of rumor stirred hope. A visitor claimed he saw a canoe wedged in reeds on a distant lake. Another said she had heard voices at night along a deserted portage. Rangers checked, finding only logs half submerged or the calls of owls echoing through the forest. Each false lead reopened the pain, leaving families exhausted and wary of hope. In the wider community, theories continued to spread. Some swore the couple had drowned in waters too deep to ever yield their bodies. Others insisted human hands were involved, that someone had crossed their path with violence. A smaller group still clung to the idea that Mark and Lila had chosen to vanish, though those who knew them dismissed the notion as cruel nonsense. With every passing year, the truth seemed further away, buried under layers of speculation. The Boundary Waters remained indifferent. Seasons shifted, ice melting to water, storms giving way to calm. The lakes glittered in the sun, beautiful and impenetrable. And beneath that surface, the fate of the couple rested, untouchable, leaving their families to navigate grief that refused to settle into certainty. 8 years gone, and still, the wilderness held them tight, unwilling to let go. By the 9th year, the Jensen case had become a shadow, lingering in the minds of those who had followed it but rarely spoken of openly anymore. For new generations of paddlers entering the Boundary Waters, it was just another story told in the dim light of a cabin or around a fire, a tale of two people who vanished into the water and never came back. But for their families, the silence was unbearable. Time had not dulled the ache. It had only sharpened it by stretching uncertainty into nearly a decade. Lila's sister tried to press the county into reopening the search, citing technological advances in sonar that might reveal wreckage in deeper lakes. Officials listened politely, acknowledged her persistence, but explained that budgets were limited and resources were tied to active cases. She left each meeting more frustrated, convinced that without relentless pressure, her sister and brother-in-law would be forgotten completely. In private moments, she admitted the greater fear was not just that they were gone, but that no one would ever know how or why. Mark's parents carried their grief differently. They began hosting small gatherings at their Duluth home, inviting neighbors and friends to share memories over coffee. They called them Remembrance Evenings, though the unspoken hope was that by keeping Mark and Lila's story alive, someone new might hear it and offer information long overlooked. Most nights ended with tears and silence, yet the couple insisted the ritual gave them strength. Better to speak the names aloud than let them fade. The media occasionally revisited the case, especially when another disappearance in the region stirred comparisons. Reporters would call, asking for comment, forcing families to relive the details once more. Each interview brought a rush of old images: the canoe sliding from shore, the abandoned tent, the quiet campsite where everything was in place except the people who had filled it. Those details never lost their power, haunting as the day they were first discovered. 9 years on, the Boundary Waters remained unchanged. Pines still lined the shore, storms still swept across the lakes, and the water still reflected the sky with calm indifference. The wilderness had not yielded even the smallest clue, and the families lived in that silence, waiting, hoping against reason that one day the lakes would decide to give something back. 10 years after Mark and Lila disappeared, the anniversary passed with little more than a brief mention in a local newspaper, a few paragraphs tucked between stories of summer festivals and county fairs. For most, the mystery had become part of the landscape itself, a chapter in the long history of the Boundary Waters, where nature often decided the terms. But for their families, the date loomed heavy, impossible to ignore. They gathered quietly at the shore of Lake Superior, placing flowers into the water, watching the petals drift before sinking beneath the waves. No speeches were made, no reporters invited, only the silence of grief and the faint hope that the gesture might reach the couple wherever they rested. In the years since, technology had improved. Portable sonar units became more affordable, allowing hobbyists and volunteers to scan lake beds with precision once reserved for professional teams. Now and then, a diver or fisherman would call in a promising shape on a screen, a shadow that looked too symmetrical to be natural. Each time, authorities investigated, sending teams into cold, dark water only to resurface with nothing but branches or old debris. Every false alarm chipped away at the family's strength, yet they continued to answer the phone each time, unable to give up the possibility of a breakthrough. Mark's parents aged visibly under the weight of uncertainty. His father, once steady and strong, walked slower now, his steps careful, as though carrying grief in his bones. His mother's hair turned white, her voice quieter, though she still insisted on setting a candle in the window every night. Lila's sister kept her focus sharp, maintaining the website dedicated to the search, updating it with each anniversary and inviting others to share memories or theories. The entries painted a picture of lives that had not simply vanished, but left ripples that continued to spread. The wilderness remained indifferent. Each season rolled into the next, storms pounding the lakes in summer, ice locking them silent in winter. Travelers still spoke of the couple, some with reverence, others with unease. A decade had passed, yet the unanswered question persisted, hovering like mist over the water. The Boundary Waters held its secret close, as though determined to remind those who sought its beauty that it could take just as easily as it gave. By the 11th year, the disappearance of Mark and Lila Jensen had hardened into a sorrow that no longer shocked, but still refused to soften. Those who had known them spoke less often, not because they had forgotten, but because the story brought a weariness that words could not relieve. Their names would surface in quiet conversations, in pauses over dinner, in the sighs of neighbors who still remembered the sound of their laughter drifting down Duluth streets on summer evenings. For their families, however, the silence was never quiet enough. It pressed against every moment, a reminder that without bodies or belongings, grief remained suspended. Lila's sister carried her determination like armor. She arranged yearly gatherings by the lake, inviting anyone who remembered the couple to join in sharing stories. The numbers dwindled each year, yet she pressed on, convinced that keeping their memory alive was its own form of resistance against the erasure of time. Sometimes, late at night, she reread her sister's old journal, the one found in their car, tracing her fingers over the ink as if it might lead her to the last steps Lila ever took. Mark's parents, by then in their 70s, had grown quiet in their struggle. They still drove north each summer, parking at the same trailhead, walking the first stretch of portage where the couple had last been seen. They would sit side by side on a fallen log, hands clasped, staring at the water as though waiting for it to return what it had taken. Neither spoke of hope anymore, but neither could accept the finality of absence. It was a vigil without end, a ritual of endurance more than expectation. Rumors still rose and fell. A paddle found on a distant shoreline proved to be modern, belonging to a tourist who lost it weeks earlier. A decayed canoe discovered in a swamp turned out to be decades old, unrelated to the Jensens. Each false lead felt like another cut, raising hope only to extinguish it. Officials grew increasingly reluctant to respond, their patience worn thin. But the families continued to call, unwilling to let the silence close completely over the case. By then, the story had seeped into the fabric of the Boundary Waters. Campers spoke of it with unease, guides mentioned it in cautionary tones, and every red canoe glimpsed in the distance seemed to draw longer looks. 11 years had passed, and the wilderness kept its secret, as steady and unyielding as the waters themselves. By the 12th year, the story of Mark and Lila lingered mostly in quiet spaces, carried less by headlines and more by memory. Their families had learned to live with the rhythm of absence, though it never felt natural. Birthdays passed with candles blown out by trembling hands, anniversaries were marked by flowers placed in still water, and holidays left chairs unfilled at the table. Life moved forward around them, but for those closest to the couple, time had not so much healed as hollowed, leaving room only for questions. Lila's sister continued to keep the search alive in small ways. She organized online posts, sharing photographs of her sister and Mark in happier days, urging strangers to remember them. Some responded with kind words, others with speculation, each message a reminder that the case had not disappeared entirely into the fog of the past. Late at night, she often reread the notes from the original investigation, the carefully drawn maps, the search grids traced over the lakes. She knew them by heart, yet still studied them, convinced that somewhere in those lines lay a clue everyone else had missed. Mark's parents had slowed with age. Their summer trips to the trailhead grew shorter, their walks less steady. Still they went, holding hands as they traced the path that had once led their son and his wife into the wilderness. Sometimes they left flowers, other times they left only their silence, sitting on the rocks until the sun dipped low. Neighbors who saw them return always noted the same thing. They looked older each time, carrying the weight of grief like a stone that could not be set down. Occasional rumors stirred faint hope. A hunter reported spotting a canoe in a marshy backwater, but rangers found nothing. A fisherman thought he had pulled up fabric from the depths, only to discover weeds tangled in his line. Each false lead was another wound, reminding the families how fragile hope had become. The Boundary Waters remained unmoved. Its lakes mirrored the sky, its forests stretched unbroken, and its storms rolled in without warning. In its vast silence, the truth about Mark and Lila remained hidden, waiting perhaps for some future accident or storm to disturb the waters and reveal what had been lost for so long. 12 years gone, and the wilderness kept its secret, as patient as grief itself. By the 13th year, the case had become a hollow echo in police files, one of those mysteries that gathered dust but never fully disappeared. Detectives who had once walked the shoreline with maps in their hands had retired, and younger officers knew the story only as a cautionary tale passed down during training. The missing couple were names on old posters, their smiles preserved in fading ink. For the families, however, Mark and Lila were not relics of a case, but living memories woven into every day. Lila's sister often drove north to sit by the water. She would bring her children, who were growing old enough to ask questions. She told them about their aunt, about her love for photography, about how she had planned to publish a book of Minnesota landscapes. She never explained the full story, only that their aunt had gone missing on the lake. Some part of her resisted burdening them with the full weight of the truth. Yet she admitted privately that part of her visits were for herself, to feel that she was still searching even when the trail had long gone cold. Mark's parents carried their grief in smaller, quieter ways. His father repaired old paddles in the garage, sanding and oiling the wood, though he had no reason to use them anymore. His mother kept the garden blooming with the flowers Lila had loved. They did not speak often of what had happened, but everything they tended was in memory of what was lost. Neighbors understood, offering gentle nods when they passed, acknowledging sorrow that had no end. Rumors still surfaced, almost ritual by now. A tourist swore he had seen initials carved into a tree near a campsite, but when checked, it proved to be a different name altogether. Another reported finding fabric snagged in a root system along the shore, yet testing showed it belonged to recent camping gear. Each rumor carried a brief spark of hope that quickly burned out, leaving the families more weary. The wilderness remained unchanged, the waters deep and unmoved, the trees whispering in the wind. 13 years gone, and the silence stretched on. The Boundary Waters offered no answers, only the steady reminder that some truths could remain hidden indefinitely, locked away in the vast and indifferent arms of nature. By the 14th year, the Jensen disappearance had settled into a haunting rhythm, a story people repeated without expecting resolution. It had become part of the identity of the Boundary Waters, folded into the lore of the region, alongside tales of lost trappers and vanished voyagers. Guides mentioned the couple to new paddlers as a quiet warning, their names spoken with the same reverence reserved for storms and sudden cold fronts, but for the families, it was not legend. It was a wound that refused to close, reopening each time the seasons turned, and another year was added to the count. Lila's sister kept her vigil alive through small acts. She organized memorial paddles where friends and strangers alike would set canoes onto the water in silence, letting the ripples spread outward as a symbol of endurance. She kept a candle burning in her window each night, convinced that no matter how much time passed, her sister's memory must remain visible. She said it was the only way to fight back against the suffocating weight of forgetting. Mark's parents had grown frail with age, but they continued their yearly journey north. They moved more slowly now, resting often along the trailhead that had once been filled with search teams. They still sat at the same spot by the water, hands clasped, staring at the horizon as if watching for the canoe that never returned. They rarely spoke about hope anymore, but neither of them could bear to stay away. Silence was the only conversation left, and it was enough. Every so often the phone would ring with another lead. A camper claimed to have found bones near a portage trail, but they belonged to a deer. A fisherman swore he had hooked something heavy and metallic beneath the water, but divers uncovered only a rusted barrel. The pattern repeated itself, hope rising briefly only to collapse under disappointment. The families braced themselves for these calls, knowing that each one cut as deeply as the first. The boundary waters gave nothing back. The lakes remained dark and inscrutable. The forests whispered in winds that carried no answers. 14 years had passed since Mark and Lila set out with their canoe, and the wilderness still held its silence, patient and unyielding, as though guarding a truth it was never meant to release. By the 15th year the mystery had grown so heavy it seemed almost immovable, like a stone sunk deep beneath the water. For outsiders it was a story nearly forgotten, something recalled only when another hiker or paddler went missing in the North Woods. But for the families it remained a daily presence, lodged into every moment of ordinary life. Each holiday, each milestone was measured against the absence of Mark and Lila. Their names were still spoken at the dinner table, not as a memory, but as if they might still walk through the door. Lila's sister felt the weight of time most sharply. She had built her life around keeping the story alive, maintaining the website and organizing gatherings, yet more often she found herself speaking into a void. The calls from reporters had stopped years earlier. The vigils grew smaller until only a handful of people came. Still, she continued, convinced that if she stopped, the couple would be lost entirely to silence. She took comfort in routine, in lighting a candle each night, in whispering her sister's name before bed. Mark's parents carried their grief more quietly, though it had etched itself into every line of their faces. Their visits to the trailhead had become less frequent as age slowed their steps, but they still kept the ritual alive when they could. They would sit by the water in silence, not speaking, not searching, only keeping watch. Neighbors who asked how they were doing received polite answers, but those who looked closely could see the wear of 15 years of waiting. Occasional fragments of rumor still surfaced. A hunter came forward with a story of finding a red canoe tucked beneath a bluff, but when rangers checked, it was nothing more than a faded tarp. Another claimed to have heard voices across the water late at night, though investigators dismissed it as echoes carrying strangely in the stillness. Each time, the families endured the cruel cycle of hope and disappointment, and each time it left them more hollow. 15 years gone, and the boundary waters remained unchanged. The lakes glittered under summer sun, froze beneath winter ice, and gave nothing back. Beneath that beauty lay silence, patient and unbroken, holding tight to a truth that refused to rise. For the families, the wait had become a way of life, a vigil without end, as though time itself was conspiring to keep Mark and Lila hidden. By the 16th year, the story of Mark and Lila had become almost spectral, drifting in and out of memory depending on who was asked. For locals, it was a tale passed on to visitors as a warning about the power of the wilderness. For their families, it remained a raw wound that never healed. 16 summers had come and gone, each one marking another year without answers, another year of silence from the waters that had swallowed them whole. The anniversary was marked with little more than a small gathering in Duluth. A few friends came, along with Lila's sister and Mark's parents, though they moved slowly now, fragile with age. They lit candles, placed them at the edge of the water, and watched the flames drift away on tiny rafts of wood. The ritual was simple, but it held weight. Each flame was a message, a plea for remembrance, a hope that the Boundary Waters might one day return something of the couple who had vanished there. Life had changed for everyone except the missing. Lila's sister had grown older, raising children who now asked harder questions about the aunt they never knew. She explained carefully, telling them about Lila's love of books, of photography, of adventure. She did not linger on the darkness, but she could not keep it from her voice entirely. Mark's parents rarely spoke about their son anymore, yet in their home, his belongings remained untouched. A pair of boots by the back door, a stack of maps in his handwriting, each preserved as though he might still return to claim them. The investigation file sat in storage, rarely touched. Detectives admitted there was nothing left to chase. Rumors still drifted in occasionally, but they were thinner now, less urgent, and almost always false. The case was technically open, but in practice it was frozen, as cold as the lakes themselves in winter. The Boundary Waters continued, as it always had, vast and unmoved, a place where storms rose suddenly and silence followed. And then, just as the 16th summer was waning, a storm unlike any in years rolled across the region. Winds tore through trees, waves pounded the shoreline, and when it passed, the waters began to give back what they had held for so long. Among the broken branches and storm debris, something unexpected began to stir on the shore. The storm that lashed across northern Minnesota left behind a battered landscape. Trees lay toppled along the lakeshore, their roots twisted and bare, and the water was thick with debris carried in by the wind. Locals walked the shoreline in the days that followed, gathering branches, hauling driftwood, and checking cabins for damage. It was during one of these quiet recoveries that a fisherman named Carl Holvik noticed something wedged among the tangle of roots at the edge of Rainy Lake. At first he thought it was another branch, weathered smooth by years of water. But when he bent closer, the shape was unmistakable. It was a canoe paddle, half buried in mud and storm litter. He pulled it free with effort, the wood heavy and waterlogged, its surface dark with mold. Yet beneath the wear, faint markings remained. Scratched into the handle were initials, nearly lost to time but still visible. M and L. Carl stood in silence, the weight of recognition settling on him. He remembered the story of the missing couple, the endless searches, the photographs that had once covered bulletin boards. He carried the paddle carefully back to his truck, unsure of what he held, but certain it mattered. At the sheriff's office, deputies examined the find with a mixture of disbelief and caution. The paddle was catalogued, photographed, and placed in evidence. Forensic experts were called, their task to determine whether it truly belonged to Mark and Lila Jensen or if coincidence had played a cruel trick. Word spread quickly through the small community, stirring memories long buried. For many, the paddle was the first tangible sign in 16 years that the wilderness had not erased the couple completely. When Lila's sister received the call, she sat stunned in her kitchen, her coffee cooling untouched on the table. The news rippled through her body in waves of grief and fragile hope. For Mark's parents, the information brought tears they had not allowed themselves to shed in years. The discovery of a single paddle did not answer the questions that haunted them, but it cracked open the silence that had defined the case for so long. The Boundary Waters had finally given something back, and with it came the promise that the truth might still rise to the surface. The paddle was sent to a forensic lab in Street Paul, where technicians worked carefully, treating it less as an artifact and more as a fragile witness pulled from the depths of time. The wood was examined under magnification, its fibers scarred from years of exposure to water, its surface etched with grooves that matched patterns of long use. The initials M and L, though softened by erosion, were still identifiable as hand-carved rather than naturally formed. Chemical tests confirmed layers of aged varnish consistent with the early 2000s, the kind sold in outdoor stores at the time. What surprised investigators most was that traces of DNA remained. The paddle's handle, where hands had once gripped it again and again, held microscopic fragments embedded in the grain. The lab compared them against samples preserved from the original investigation. After weeks of careful work, results came back conclusive. Both Mark and Lila's DNA was present, confirming without doubt that the paddle had belonged to them. The finding reignited interest in the case. Reporters who had not spoken the Jensens' names in over a decade began calling again, asking for comment, pressing the sheriff's department for details. Headlines reappeared in local papers. Missing couple's paddle found after 16 years. Television crews returned to Duluth, their cameras pointed at the homes of grieving families who had thought the world had forgotten. For the first time in years, the mystery felt alive again, breathing with possibility. For the families, the discovery was bittersweet. Mark's parents sat at their kitchen table holding the photographs the lab had taken, their hands trembling. They spoke of how the paddle had been one of a pair purchased just before the 2003 trip, and how Mark had carefully carved their initials into the wood as a gesture of permanence. To see it resurface after so long was both a comfort and a wound, proof that their children had been real, present on those waters, yet still unreachable. Lila's sister clung to the news with cautious hope. She wondered if the paddle had drifted for years, or if it had been trapped somewhere until the storm tore it free. If one item could survive, perhaps more remained hidden. The discovery had not answered the great question of what happened, but it had reopened the door, and with it came the fragile belief that the boundary waters might finally loosen its hold on the rest of the truth. The recovery of the paddle shifted the case from a faded memory into an active investigation once more. Detectives who had long since filed the Jensen disappearance into the back of their minds now reopened old folders, spreading photographs and search maps across desks that had not seen them in years. Fresh eyes were brought in, younger officers who had grown up hearing the story as local lore. For them, holding the paddle was like touching a ghost, a reminder that this was not just legend but a tragedy rooted in reality. Search teams returned to the boundary waters with renewed urgency. Sonar equipment was deployed on lakes that had been too difficult to scan in the early years, technology far more advanced than what was once available. Boats traced patient grids across the water, their screens flickering with pale shapes that divers investigated. Each descent was met with tense anticipation, though most ended with little more than logs or rock formations. Still, the work pressed forward, fueled by the knowledge that the lakes had already released one artifact. For the families, the investigation's revival reopened wounds that had never closed. Lila's sister traveled north to meet with detectives, carrying binders of notes she had kept for over a decade. She pointed to areas on the old maps she believed had been overlooked, her voice trembling as she explained how certain trails might have carried the couple further than originally believed. Mark's parents, frail but determined, attended briefings quietly, their presence a reminder that this was not just an unsolved mystery, but a living grief. The paddle itself became a symbol, displayed carefully in a secure case at the sheriff's office when not under analysis. Reporters who viewed it remarked on how ordinary it looked, just a piece of wood worn smooth by years of use, yet its weight in the story was immeasurable. Its survival against storms and time suggested that the rest of the couple's belongings might still be out there, waiting beneath the water or hidden along the shore. As autumn settled in, the families gathered once more at the shoreline, where the search had begun 16 years earlier. This time, their candles burned not just for remembrance, but for the first fragile glimmer of possibility. The wilderness had finally spoken, and they could not help but believe that more would follow. Winter arrived quickly that year, freezing the lakes before search teams could finish their renewed efforts. The discovery of the paddle had sparked a wave of activity, but now snow covered the trails and ice locked the waters in silence once more. Investigators packed away their sonar units and divers' gear, promising to return in spring, yet the pause felt agonizing for the families. After 16 years of stillness, momentum had finally begun, and the weight of waiting again was almost unbearable. Forensic reports trickled in through the cold months, providing both answers and more questions. The paddle carried no fingerprints other than Mark and Lila's, though tiny fragments of fabric fiber were recovered from the wood. Experts could not confirm their origin, but Lila's sister was certain they matched the jacket her sister had worn on that final trip. The findings were circumstantial, yet powerful in the eyes of those who had lived in uncertainty for so long. Media coverage surged briefly, with documentaries and podcasts revisiting the case. Reporters interviewed the fishermen who had found the paddle, detectives who had worked the early search, and the families who still carried grief like a second skin. For many viewers, it was the first time they had heard of the Jensen disappearance. For those who had followed it from the beginning, the coverage reopened old wounds, playing back the unanswered questions that had haunted them for years. Mark's parents did not participate in interviews. Age had left them weary, their grief now a private burden. They kept a copy of the paddle's photograph framed on their mantel, lighting a candle beneath it each night. Lila's sister, though, welcomed the renewed attention. She spoke passionately about the need for persistence, for the belief that the wilderness could not keep its secret forever. She urged investigators to press on as soon as the thaw came, convinced that the storm had been the first crack in the silence. The boundary waters in winter looked deceptively peaceful, the lake sealed beneath thick ice, the trees bowed under snow. Yet beneath the surface, the truth waited. The paddle's return had proven that nothing vanished completely. With spring would come another chance, and the families held to that promise, their hope fragile but alive in the quiet months of waiting. When the ice finally broke and spring returned to the north, investigators launched their search again with the same determination that had marked the early days so many years ago. Boats skimmed across the dark water, sonar units sweeping every contour of the lakebed, while divers descended into the silence below. It was slow, painstaking work, but there was a sense that the storm's gift of the paddle had been a signal, proof that the wilderness would no longer keep its silence completely. In May, one of the sonar scans revealed an unusual shadow lying in a sheltered bay. Divers followed the signal and soon reported the outline of a canoe, cracked and half buried in silt. When it was carefully raised, the faded red paint left no doubt. It was the Jensen's canoe, scarred by years of water but still carrying fragments of their gear wedged beneath the seats. Inside were remnants of clothing, scraps of fabric that matched what Lila had been wearing, and a rusted metal cooking pot they had taken on every trip. The discovery brought both relief and sorrow. Forensic analysis confirmed that the couple had likely drowned, victims of a capsize on open water, their bodies never recovered. No evidence of violence was found, no sign of a struggle beyond the battered canoe itself. After 16 years, the mystery yielded its truth in the simplest and saddest form. Nature had claimed them, and only now returned pieces of their story. For the families, closure came in fragments. Lila's sister wept as she touched the recovered paddle, now cleaned and preserved, knowing it had carried her sister's hands across the water. Mark's parents attended a lakeside ceremony where the canoe was gently lowered back into the water as part of a memorial, a symbolic act of returning them to the place they had loved most. Candles floated out across the bay that evening, their reflections trembling on the waves, carrying with them both grief and gratitude. The boundary waters remained vast and untamed, its beauty shadowed by the knowledge of what it could take. Yet for the first time in 16 years, silence gave way to answers. Though sorrow lingered, the families could finally speak of Mark and Lila in the past tense, their story complete, their love and laughter carried forever in memory like ripples spreading across the lake.